Today's stuff we're going to be learning is Bava Batra Daf Kuf Mem Gimel. Today's stuff is sponsored by Audrey Levant in honor of Jerry Goldstein Gedalia's grandson Moshe on his bar mitzvah in Ottawa, Canada, this Shabbat. Mazal tov. Okay, I want to go back to one thing because I got confused yesterday, and I'm not sure in the end that I explained it clearly enough. So I want to just go back and start again with the Mima'et Bechelik Bechora and use some numbers to make it kind of simplified. Or just easier to understand. So we had this question about the ubar. Remember the whole sugya. Maybe I'll just start with one small thing because I want to compare this later. We started with this whole big sugya: is ubar koneh or not koneh? In terms of the structure, we're going to see something structured in a totally different sugya, but the exact same way as yesterday. So I want to just point that out. We started with Rav Huna, the sort of position of Rav Huna that ubar is lo koneh at all, and how he rejected our Mishnah. But then the Gemara said, well, this is part of a bigger machloket because it's not just Rav Huna, but we then said Rav Nachman said mizakelu bar lo kana, but if you use a certain language, it works. It's like an in-between position. Rav Huna then we had who says definitely not, and then we have Rav Sheshet who said definitely yes and completely in every situation. Okay, so we have three opinions: Rav Nachman, Rav Huna, Rav Sheshet. Today we're going to have Rav Nachman, Rav Hamnuna, and Rav Sheshet. Okay. And then we have Rav Sheshet try to prove his own opinion by saying, Minamin Allah, where do I get my position from? And it's exactly what we're going to do at the beginning of today's talk. Okay, that was just one small point. Then we got into this whole thing about this other thing about the ubar, this mishnah, tinok ben yom nochel u'manchil, and we wanted to understand what that means. So I got a little confused yesterday but it's a case where no matter what, the father dies and then the baby dies. And the baby either dies in utero or dies after, once it's born. And that was the big difference. They said, oh, it doesn't really mean it can't be as proof for what you're looking for, because perhaps it means as one explanation was, the ubar who's born 1 day old is mima'et b'chelik b'chora, lessens the portion of the firstborn, whereas if it was an ubar, it doesn't. Okay, the case with the ubar is very simple. If the father dies and then the fetus never makes it, so Reuven, let's say there's two brothers, Reuven and Shimon inherit the way they would as if they were two brothers. The ubar is not taken into consideration in any way, shape, or form, because basically there are two brothers, there were two brothers, there are two brothers, there was never a third brother because the third brother was never born. But if that child is born for 1 day and then the child dies, right? Then, so if they inherit equally, well, Reuven's the Bechor, Reuven's going to get 66.7%, and Shimon's going to get 33.3, because we're going to divide this. That's the first case where the baby's never born, father dies, then the fetus doesn't make it. Well, the fetus is not ochel u'manchil, and therefore 66.7 to 33.3. However, if the baby's born alive for seemingly, let's say, 1 hour, and then the baby dies and the father had died before, so what happens? Well, the baby inherits enough to basically limit now, and the baby's not going to get any inheritance. His inheritance is going to be divided by the brothers, but enough to limit the portion of the firstborn. So how does this work? When they calculate the firstborn's portion, they're going to calculate it as if there's 4 parts and not 3 parts, right? 3 sons means 4 parts. And then Reuven is going to get 50%. Shimon's going to get a quarter, and the newborn baby is going to get a quarter. When the newborn baby dies, that quarter is divided evenly between Reuven and Shimon. So let's say there's $100. Okay, so before, in the first scenario, Reuven gets $67.5, Shimon gets 33.3. But in the second scenario, Reuven starts off with 50, Shimon starts off with 25, Levi has 25. Now, when Levi dies at 25, which is going to be split in half, Levi's is going to be divided evenly between Reuven and Shimon, 12 and a half, 12 and a half. So let's do the math. Shimon had 25 plus 12 and a half gets 37.5 as opposed to 33.3. And Reuven's portion is going to be depleted somewhat because he got a firstborn portion on less money. So he's going to end up with, what do we have? 50 plus 12.5. He's going to end up with 62.5. So that's the way it works. That's what it means. Hope that made more sense. I'm sorry I got confused with it yesterday. Okay, moving on to today's stuff. So now we have the case of this father who died, the father who wants to get married to this woman and decides maybe to convince her to marry him. He says, I'm promising all your unborn children, they're going to inherit me and not my other children that I already have. Comes the older child and says, how are you writing me out of your will? Now remember, the father actually can't do. The promise was an empty promise because you can't promise anything to children who, first of all, forget ubar or not ubar. They're not even, she hasn't even conceived them yet. So that doesn't work. But the father said the following statement, and that's our whole question. Does this statement work? You will get a portion, to make the brother feel better, the son feel better. You will get a portion like all your brothers when it comes to dividing it, meaning all your future brothers who are going to be born, when it comes to dividing, you'll get a portion just like them. Now, the question is, does this really mean something or not? Because he's promising them something that doesn't exist right now. You're going to get a portion like your other brothers, but your other brothers get nothing right now. In other words, what he's saying really is, I should maybe make it more clear. What he's saying is, you're getting a portion with your other brothers, like I promised them. I'll promise you a portion just like I promised them. But what he promised them was nothing. So you're going to get nothing with nothing, right? With the people who are getting nothing. So the question is now, in the end, of course, they're all going to inherit because they're all his sons. So when he dies, whatever he said now was meaningless. Or perhaps what he said, I'm going to promise you, you'll get a portion with your brothers just like they're getting. Maybe that means you're going to get an extra portion when I divide it. Because again, what he's saying right now is, I'm promising you now a portion. But what's the portion? The portion is just like the other brothers getting. The other brothers aren't getting anything right now because they're not in existence and the statement was meaningless. So that's the big question. Rabbi Yirmiyah and a bunch of rabbis said this works, including Rabbi Avia. Rabbi Avia and a bunch of other rabbis said this doesn't work because you're saying you're getting the same thing as people who are getting zero, and zero is zero, basically. So you might get the same thing they're getting, but they're getting nothing, so you're getting nothing. So then we have Rabbi Yirmiyah. Rabbi Abba came to Rabbi Yirmiyah and said, who do we follow? Rabbi Yirmiyah said, of course, we follow us because we're the older ones. You're just mere children. He was dismissing them. To which Rabbi Avia said, what do you mean? I thought it doesn't go by age. I thought it goes by who brings the better logic, and we have a better answer. So Rabbi Yirmiyah said, what's your answer? He says, go ask Rabbi Avin, because I already explained it to Rabbi Avin, who was on Rabbi Yirmiyah's side, and he nodded his head in agreement with me. So Rabbi Avia was being kind of smart about things and says, I'm not going to explain it to you. Go ask Rabbi Avin. I already convinced him, so he'll convince you. And he was on your side, and he switched to my side, so I must be right. So that's what we're up to in the story. Azal legabe. So he goes right now. Rabbi Yirmiyah goes to Rabbi Avin, and Rabbi Avin tells him, Amar le, ilu amar le k'nei kechamor mikane. Rabbi Avin says to him, if I said to you, go acquire, just like this donkey acquired, would you acquire the item? No. Like if I'm giving you a gift and I say, here, acquire this gift like the donkey does. Well, a donkey can't acquire. And why they're using an example of a donkey, and I was thinking it would be a good research project to see when the Gemara uses the term donkey and why that would be the term people would use. Right? Donkey's usually considered, again, it actually comes up in different contexts, different uses, but here it's being saying, someone who doesn't have the ability to have knowledge can't do an act of acquiring. Why someone would say this, I have no idea. And it really requires some thought into thinking why, because we're going to talk about k'nei kechamor and k'nei at v'chamor. Okay, you and the donkey should acquire. Why anyone would ever say this, I don't know. You could say it's a purely theoretical case, but it would be weird they would actually have a debate about this kind of a case and a whole discussion about it. Could be people use this terminology. I really don't know why. I think maybe we had to live in their time to really understand it. But anyway, donkey, I don't think is used the way we use donkey. That's really my point. This is meaning something else. I'm not really sure. So if somebody says, acquire like a donkey, it doesn't work. So therefore, if the father said, go acquire like I just gave the part to your brothers, you'll get a part just like them. Well, of course, that's nothing. They get nothing, you'll get nothing, just like nothing. De'itmar, how do we know this? And this is going to get us off on a totally different topic, which is, it was said, k'nei kechamor lo kane. That everybody agreed about. But at v'chamor, if I say you and the donkey, that we're going to have a three-way machloka. And here's where our sugya is going to be exactly parallel to yesterday's, other than what I said, Rav Hamnuna is going to be switched with Rav Hamnuna. So Rav Nachman amal kana mechze, and their position is going to be very similar, in, at least structurally. So if I say you and the donkey will acquire this field, so what do you get? Rav Nachman says you get half. The donkey obviously doesn't acquire the other half, but neither do you, because the person only promised you and the donkeys if the two of you should share it. Now, of course, you can't share, but you get half. Rav Hamnuna amar lo amar klum. Rav Hamnuna, similar to Rav Huna in the previous, said, right, Nubar is not koneh no matter what. Remember, Rav Nachman had that middle position, depending on the wording. This isn't depending on the wording, but this is also a middle position. Half you get. Rav Hamnuna says you don't get anything because I put together in the sentence you and the donkey. The donkey can't acquire anything. Basically, Rav Hamnuna kind of looks at this like you like the donkey. If I'm putting you in the same category and the donkey can't acquire, then obviously I don't really mean for you to acquire anything. Not obviously, but that's Rav Hamnuna. It's obvious. Rav Sheshet amar, kana hakol. Just like by the ubar completely could be kone, no matter what language you use. Also here, Rav Sheshet has that kind of opinion. You acquire the whole thing. We just ignore the fact that the person mentioned the donkey. Obviously, they were trying to give away the field, and they can't give away the field to the donkey, so they must have meant whoever can acquire it will acquire the whole thing. And Rav Sheshet says you get the whole field. So I'm Rav Sheshet, menamin ala. First thing we're going to do is Rav Sheshet's going to try to bring a proof. Ditanya, as it says in a Braita, Rabbi Yossi Omer. Okay, we're going to get off on a totally different topic now, but use it as a comparison. So the background is, we've seen this before, when I take teruma, okay, which is 1/50th, let's say, it could be 1/40th, 1/60th, let's just go with 1/50th, and I have a pile of zucchinis, and I want to take one out of the 50 zucchinis for teruma. But there's a little bit of a problem because you can't take, if I take a bad zucchini, I can't separate the bad zucchini and give it to the kohanim, and with that, right, do my teruma on the good ones, because ema frishim ala tova. You can't separate a bad one and give that to the kohanim for obvious reasons. It's not appropriate what you're going to give away to the kohen, the bad. So what they're going to point out here is kishuim, which could be zucchini, could be cucumbers, and it's really hard to know the reality because it seems like there was a part of it that was inedible. And it's the inner part. Now, it could be by inner. I was thinking maybe, on the zucchini, there's the tip of the zucchini, the part you can't eat. Maybe they're talking about that. I'm not really sure. But maybe there's zucchinis or cucumbers or whatever this is in their family. Maybe they were different than the ones we have today. Maybe they're talking more about a squash, like the inner part of the squash. Whatever it is, it's some sort of inedible bitter, very bitter part. If you think about it in the squash, usually those stringy parts in the middle of a butternut squash is very bitter. Not sure. But somehow you have something that's really, in the Quran actually translated as inedible. I don't know if it's inedible, but very bitter. And then you have the rest of it, which is good. I'm going to have a problem if I take one whole zucchini because I don't know how much bitter is in that zucchini and how much good. It's good. Basically, it's going to be like matok and mar, sweet and bitter. So if I take 1/50th, I need to take 1/50th of the good against all the good. Who knows? Maybe all the other zucchinis have less bad part, and this one has a lot of bad part in it. And then I won't have my proper ratio. So this is a background to what we're saying. Rabbi Yossi Omer, Ein lecha mal bakishut ela pnimi shebo. The part that's bitter is the inner part, which I think he's trying to say, and we don't know how to assess how much there is. And therefore, lefichach kishut torem mosif al hachitzon shebo v'torem. You have to add, and there's many different interpretations exactly how much you add, but you have to add, let's say, cut off some of the outer part of the better part of a different zucchini, and take that as well. In addition to your one whole zucchini, take some extra so that you make sure that the ratio is right of the good to the good. Amai. Now, why should this work? Because, now what does this have to do with our topic? At v'chamorhu. This is like separating good and bad together on the good and the bad. Now, theoretically, we could say, you've separated here within your teruma, you have good and bad mixed in. That's like at v'chamor. And we basically say what we look at to calculate is just the one, right? When we're doing the 1 to 50 of the good, and we ignore the bad. So this is Rav Sheshet. He's basically saying, we just don't look at the bad at all. And therefore, it's like at v'chamor, where we don't look at the chamor and we give you completely everything. Not exactly there's an accurate comparison, but that's his suggestion. To which the Gemara rejects for a totally different reason. And you might remember this. Even though we've learned a bunch of times, you can't take a bad lemon, let's say, on all your beautiful lemons and keep your own lemons to yourself and give the coin the bad one. But if you do it, it's actually effective. Okay, we'll see in a minute how we know this is true. Since it's effective, this is an at v'chamor. it's not effective to do a kinyan with a chamor, but it is effective to take just the bitter part as truma. It would work, even though you shouldn't do it. Okay, how do we know this? And then we basically say it's not a comparison. How do we know it? And it's always a bit of a weird proof, but you'll see. How do you know that if you do it anyway, you shouldn't do it, but if you do it anyway, it's valid? It's effective, I should say. The pasuk says, you don't want to get a sin. How do you prevent yourself from getting a sin? By taking, you take from the good part of it. Okay? That's how you avoid sin, meaning don't take from the bad part, because if you take from the bad part, you'll get a sin. Okay, how do you get from there that it's effective though if you do it anyway? Well, kadosh nisiyut chet lama. If it doesn't work, now what does it mean it doesn't work? If it works, then I've turned that bad lemon that I took, into truma. And I've disgraced it because I now have something that's truma that's disgraceful because I took a really bad one and gave it to the Kohen. But if what I did is not truma, then I did nothing, basically. All I did was I took a pile of things. I separated a lemon out. I gave it to a Kohen, but it's not truma. So what have I done wrong? It wasn't effective at all. It's kind of twisted. But because I actually get a sin, because there it says you won't get a sin if you take the good, which means you do get a sin if you take the bad, it shows that it's actually effective because you've disgraced truma, and you've only disgraced truma if it's actually called truma. If it's not effective, then you actually really didn't do anything. So from here we learn mikan l'toim and ara leyafesh trumato truma, and that's why this is not a good comparison. So Rav Sheshet tried to bring a proof, we rejected it. Now we're going to have another attempt to bring a proof, and this is going to be brought as a difficulty, really on Rav Hamnuna, which is going to basically prove Rav Sheshet. Amalei Rav Mordechai le Rav Ashi. Okay, there's a bunch of different characters here, so let's try to follow. Rav Mordechai says to Rav Ashi and quotes him what Mativ Rav Avia tiyuvta, this koshi, this difficulty that Rav Avia raised against those who go against Rav Sheshet. Maaseh b'chamesh nashim, a bit of a strange case, hard for us in the modern world to understand. But there was a case with 5 women, ubahen shtei achayot, and there were 2 sisters. We actually learned this in kiddushin as well. V'liket echad kekala shel te'enim. Okay, we get all these details. You got to wonder why they're here, but the Gemara there explains why they're here, and I'll try to go through it quickly. The guy comes and goes into their field. These 5 women had a field together. 2 were sisters, 3 were, we're going to call them later, nochriot. Nochriot doesn't mean Gentiles. It might mean in modern Hebrew. But nochriot means not related to each other or to those 2 sisters. Okay, so 3 have no connection to any of the other women. 2 are sisters. Why this is important, you'll see soon. And there's a basket of figs sitting there. The man takes the basket of figs, okay, and we'll see he's going to do a betrothal with them. Now, the figs belong to the women, but it was the Shemitah year. What does that mean? In the Shemitah year, all your fruits are hefker, they're ownerless. So what did he do? He picked them up, became his, and the first thing the Gemara says in kiddushin is this teaches you that when you're zocher something from hefker, even if it belonged to someone else before, right, it now is fully your property, and you can use it even to betroth a woman. So betroth a woman, right, we always do this at the wedding, is the ring yours? Did you buy it? Did you buy it with your own money, right? This whole thing. Well, this shows even if you didn't buy it, but if you were zocher to it in a way that makes it yours, then it's yours. That's the first thing. The second thing we learn from here is that if you were to steal it, though, let's say he came into her property and he took it and then betrothed her with it, and she doesn't protest, that's not kiddushin because it was hers and it wasn't his. And that's why we always say at the wedding again, is it yours? Did you buy it? Right? If it was the woman's and she just gave it to you in a way that wasn't an effective kinyan, that wouldn't work. Okay, so those are the side points for this sugya. That's not why we brought this here. So he picks up their basket, which really wasn't their basket anymore. It was hefker. He owns it now, and then he gives it back to them. And he says the following thing, a very strange statement. I am betrothing all of you with this basket of figs. One accepted it on behalf of all of them. All the rabbis said with the following 3 words, the sisters are not betrothed. Now, why are the sisters not betrothed? This is a famous machloket Abai and Rava. It's kiddushin shelo nimseru lebi'ah. That means kiddushin that can't be consummated by sexual relations, because each of them is betrothed to him, which means you can't sleep with a woman and her sister. So if you're already betrothed to one sister, you can't sleep with the other sister because it's arayot, because you're betrothed to her sister. So he can't consummate the marriage with either one of them, and therefore he can't actually, there's no effective kiddushin here. But what do you infer from the rabbis? The kiddushin to the sisters wasn't valid, but obviously it seems like, okay, we'll see this inside, achayot hude'em mukudashot, hanochriyot mukudashot. But the Gentile, not the Gentile, sorry, I'm translating it literally. The other three women who weren't related are mekudashot. Now, amai, why would this work? Okay, remember why we're here? At v'chamor. Why is this like at v'chamor? Because in one statement he said, all five of you are betrothed to me, but three of them can't be. It's like saying, I'm giving you and the donkey the field, right? I'm giving kiddushin to all of you when some of them the kiddushin isn't valid for. So, amai at v'chamoru. This is like you and the chamor. So it works for three of you. It doesn't work for two of you. And yet it works for the three. Amar le. Okay. And that would be a contradiction to at v'chamor. A contradiction to the ones who say that this is not effective, because this is effective. They're betrothed. But Amar le, now, who's Amar le? So we started with Rav Mordechai, who said to Rav Ashi that Rav Avia raised this difficulty. And now, Rav Ashi says, Hainu dechaze Rav Huna bar Avia b'chelma. Oh, this is why Rav Huna bar Avia showed me this in a dream. Okay. Interesting. Demotive Rav Avia tiyuvta, because of this difficulty, as some people explain, because you were going to raise this difficulty against me, that's why I had a dream about this case the other day. And what did I see in the dream? In the dream, Rav Huna bar Avia showed me, could be the son of this Rav Avia, that in the dream I saw, Rav Huna bar Avia showed me that the case was not what we thought it was. The man didn't say, you're all betrothed to me, which would be at v'chamor, but the man said, probably he knew that some were sisters, so he knew that not all of them could be betrothed to him. So he said, whichever ones among you can actually have relations with me, those will be the ones betrothed to me. Okay, we're not dealing with the fact that this case is bizarre and why would somebody betroth a bunch of women all at the same time? Putting that piece of it aside, because it's not the central part for our purposes today, a bit odd that would actually happen. Just like it's a bit odd that someone would say ad b'chamor. Okay, the whole thing is right. Everything we're talking about is a bit strange, but in the end, this isn't a fair comparison because it's not ad b'chamor. He already excluded. It's like saying you and the donkey. Well, whichever one of you a kinyan is valid for will get my field. Well, then everyone would agree it would be you who would get the field, and that would be a more fair comparison. Okay, so what we did so far really was we started with the case of this son who got written out of the will and then brought back in. But was he really brought back in? Did that statement mean anything? We compared it to At Chamor. From there, we compared it to Kinei Kichamor, acquire like a donkey, which for sure everybody said wouldn't work. From there, we got off on a tangent into what if I say you and the donkey? And then is it valid? Is it not valid? Again, you have to wonder why anyone would ever make a statement like this. I don't really know why. But the question is, what did they mean by it? And then we tried to bring a proof for Rav Sheshet, and then we tried to bring another kind of proof. It raises a difficulty against the others, which really means a proof for Rav Sheshet. But both sources we showed were not comparable, and we're left with that. Moving on to another topic. Today's really all about wording I use or a person uses, or we'll see an action someone does. How do we understand it, right? We're going to have a lot of situations, it happens a lot in the Gemara, where just things are not clear and we need to know how to rule. So somebody says to his wife, again, we're talking all about inheritance. So he says to her, I'm giving my possessions to you and your sons. Amar Rav Yosef, well, we have two groups here, the woman and the sons. Let's say there's 5 sons, there's 6 people. There's 2 ways to divide that. Either she gets half and they split the other half, or she gets a portion. If there's 5 sons, we split it into 6, she gets 1/6. Okay, again, putting the firstborn issue aside. So Rav Yosef says she gets half because he's giving 2 sets of people, you and the sons. You 50%, you weigh the same as the sons. That's the way the statement works. Amar Rav Yosef Menah Minalai says, where do I get this from? Very simply from a Braita on a pasuk, Tanya. Rebbe Yomer, Vaitat la Haronu lebanav. We're talking here about the lechem apanim, the showbread that was in the temple. And the pasuk says in Vayikra, it should be divided between Aharon and his sons. And what do we know? Mechza la'Aaron, mechza lebanav. The Braita rules. Aaron got half, and his brothers divided the other, his sons divided the other half. So what do you see here? When you have two groups of people with different, right? Their Aaron was one, his sons were more than one. I think at that point, I assume it was only two. It's at the end of Vayikra. Nadav and Avihu had already died. But however many there were, they divided half, and he got his half. So there you see, just like the woman here. Abaye says, no, that's not a fair comparison. Because Bishlama hatam Aharon bar Chalukai. Lahachi pere bar Rachmana lemishka palga. Isha lav ba Yerushahi dayashetito ke'echad min abanim. They have an interesting comparison here. They say this isn't a fair comparison. Aharon, if they hadn't mentioned Aaron separately from his sons, Aaron would have gotten just like the sons. He wouldn't have been written out for any reason. So therefore, there was really no reason for the pasuk to mention him separately from the sons. Therefore, why did it mention him? That's where it says, Hereit berachmana, the Torah specifically specified Aaron, obviously to give him mishkal halga, for him to get half. Okay, meaning to give him more weight, more of something. Otherwise, if he got an even part with his sons, it would have just said all of them in one lump word. Didn't have to say Aharon and his sons. So therefore, it must be Aharon is mentioned there for some added reason, which is to get 50%. But the woman, Isha Labat Yerushai, the woman would not have inherited if the husband hadn't mentioned her. The sons would have gotten it, right? And therefore, the fact that she's mentioned is to just give her a part. But but give her just a small part. In other words, by adding her in, that gets her to stage one, that she's part of the picture. But it's not an added thing that she's then going to get half, like Aaron. Aaron was already in, his words were added to give him more. She wasn't in, her words were added to get her in. In means fair, equal share with all the brothers. To which the Gemara now questions Abaye. And that is Abaye questioned Rav Yosef. Now they're going to question Abaye. So again, Rav Yosef thinks half. Abaye thinks she just gets a portion just like all the other sons get. Ini, is that really true? So Abaye, who says she just gets a part like all the other sons and not 50%, we're now going to have a slew of questions against him. Number one, Uvada hava bin harda va'ag b'shmuel palga. Bitveria va'ag Rabbi Yochanan palga. There were two stories that happened. This exact thing. The husband said, you and your sons, and she got half. Rabbi Yochanan ruled that way. Shmuel ruled that way. So Rav Yosef, Abaye, what are you to say? No. And the two, and we're going to bring a Tannaitic source with a different case. We're going to try to compare. In the end, this comparison is going to fail, but we're still really left with the fact that Shmuel and Rabbi Yochanan ruled like Rav Yosef. Again, they were before Rav Yosef. So here we have the two Ki'ata Rav Yitzchak bar Yosef. When Rav Yitzchak bar Yosef came from Israel, he explained the following case. And flashback this week is all about taxes and all this that we're going to see from here. So you can read more about it if you want to prep before Shabbat. Read it over Shabbat if you have time. Hahu demei kalila. There was this tax that they instituted for the wealthy people. Okay, it was a tax on, it was, the Tosfot says, I'm sorry, Rashbam says it's Dmei Kalila, the Keter Malchut. It was like a crown tax. Okay, you can read about it more in Shuli's post, Shuli's article, but let's put that issue aside right now. It was generally put on wealthy people only. So it was put, this is more like if it's on wealthy people only, and then the tax was placed on Abule and Aistruge. Abule are the wealthy people, Astruge are the officers of the town. So originally it was only for the wealthy. Then they added it's for the Astruge. So now there's a question, how do we divide it? Either we say, let's say there's 100 people in the town, there's 20 wealthy people, 80 sarim, or not 20 people in the town, but 20 people in this group of these two people. So there's either you split that everybody pays an equal share, the 20 and the 80, or you say, no, the 20 wealthy pay 50%, and the other people, the sarim, the officers, pay, right? The 80 of them pay 50%. So what was the ruling here? Well, Rebbe said, I'm a Rebbe, nitvu abule palga vestruge palga. He says, the abule cover 50%, the estruge cover 50%. Now, why is this? It's just like the woman. If they hadn't mentioned her, she wouldn't have been involved. And therefore, what did Abaye say? Therefore, just mentioning her was just to get her in and pay an equal share. But that goes against this because they weren't involved. And yet when they got added, they got added to like a double. Both you have to pay a portion and you as a group have to cover 50%. And that must be, right? And that goes against Abaye. But the Gemara says, no. You think remember, we had two models. We had the Aaron model where Aaron was in anyway, and therefore mentioning him got him up to 50%. We had the woman model where she wouldn't have been in anyway, and therefore when you add her in, it must be not to get 50%. But yet here we have, it's like the woman model, and they do have to pay 50%. So that goes against Abaye. But now as the response is going to be, no. It's actually more similar to Aaron because you missed the details. It's not really the same. It's true what we said before. It was really only for the wealthy. So when the king wrote a tax here, this kind of tax was only for the wealthy. However, but the estruge were already helping. They were already, I don't know why, but the estruge, perhaps I didn't get to read Shuli's post yet, but perhaps she addresses it there. The estruge, the officers were already helping with the tax. And Yadamalka to have a kamasaya. And the king knew that. So when the king added them in, it was as if they were already there before. And by the king adding them in, what does that mean then? It's more like Aharon. Okay? The reason why he added them then, he wanted this group to pay 50% and that group to pay 50%. And then it's more like the Aharon model, and this isn't a question. So we had a three-pronged question on Abaye, which was, we have Shmuel, who ruled against him. We have second was Rabbi Yochanan who ruled against him. Those two still stand. But the difficulty we brought from this case of the Abule and the Estruge doesn't hold because it's actually more similar to Aaron than it is to the wife. Mativ Rabbi Zera. Comes Rabbi Zera with another question here, and this is a question on Rav Yosef. Today we have all these things on the outside you have to know, which is Korban Mincha, you bring 60 esronim is the amount that fits in one bowl. Okay, kli sharet. You have to put the mincha, the dough, and mix it, the flour, in this bowl. It has to be a bowl where you can mix it. The bowl fits 40, but with the overflow, you can get to 60. More than that, you can't put in one bowl. So if somebody promises to the temple 100 isaron, that's right, of flour, of solet, that's too much. Doesn't fit in one bowl. And the person said, b'shnei kelim, I'm going to bring it in two vessels. So if you say in two vessels, what would you say? Does it mean split it 50-50, right? So this is going to be on Rav Yosef, because Rav Yosef says when you say she and the sons means, my wife and the sons means 50-50. So two kelim should be 50-50, but that's not what it says here. Maybe shishim b'kli echad, v'arba'im b'kli echad. You bring 60 in one vessel, 40 in the other. Ve'imevi, turning now to Amabet, imevi, chamishim b'kli echad, v'chamishim b'kli echad yatsa. If you happen to bring 50-50, 50 in one, 50 in the other, you're yotze, but really you should be doing 60-40. Im hevi'in lechatchila lo, right? It sounds like if you did 50-50, it works, but ideally you shouldn't be doing that. Now, here comes the question. Isakadatak, koki agavna, palga b'palgu. If you said, when you say to put it in, divide it into two, you mean 50-50, like Rav Yosef says, afilu lechatchila nami, it should work even in an ideal world. If you start that way, it should work. And not, if you do it because you wanted to do it that way, it should work, but it doesn't. You shouldn't. So difficulty with Rav Yosef, to which the Gemara says, this is not a fair comparison. It's not at all the same. Hachi Ashta, we're having a lot of comparisons today that are kind of out there, and then the Gemara is going to say, yeah, this isn't really a good comparison. Hatam Anan Saadeh, in that case, we all know, Anan Saadeh means we're all witnesses, which really means it's totally obvious. Dehai Gavra mi kar korban gadol kamachavin. He really was just trying to say, I want to bring a very large korban, right? It's like when a donor comes and says, I'm giving a huge donation, you wanted to bring something really big to the temple, 100 isaron. Well, then he mentions that I'm bringing it in two kelim, but he didn't say I'm bringing two kelim to tell everybody I'm dividing it evenly. That wasn't his point. He just mentioned the two kelim because he knew, I know this doesn't fit in one vessel. But therefore, come to Efshalai Tuya, my Tina. But he obviously is going to fill the first vessel. The whole idea is fill it up as much as you can, and then the overflow is going to go into the next one. This has nothing to do with how to divide things. We actually saw this not so long ago on Daf Kuf Yud Daled Amud Bet that we hold like Rav Yosef against Rabba in two cases, and in the third case it's against Abaye. Some people say Abaye, actually, well, we know that Abaye was brought up by Rabba, so perhaps that's why it's here that maybe Abaye was reflecting Rabba's position. That's one way to say it, and then explain how all these have to do with Rabba. But we possibly like Rav Yosef in all three cases. There's a debate. We talked about this last time. All three cases happen to be Bava Batra and Daf Yud Bet Amud Bet and Daf Kuf Yud Daled Amud Aleph, actually, I think it is. Whatever, either which way you'll check. But the halacha is like Rav Yosef in three cases. Whether it means, otherwise we always hold like Rabba in all of Shas or just in Bava Batra. That's a debate. Okay, and it's an important debate because we have to know how to paskin, right? When you get going back to the Shiur of Gefet this week, how do we know how we paskin? This is an important thing, how you explain this sentence. Because this sentence basically means when Rabba disagrees with Rav Yosef, other than our case, doesn't really have Rabba, but we generally hold like Rabba, but in these we'll hold like Rav Yosef. Or maybe it doesn't mean that exactly, right? These are important things when you're determining halacha. But for our purposes, a little less important. Let's just go on. We now want to describe the three cases. We want to remember what the three cases are. It's always good to refresh our memory. Sadeh is if I buy a field next to our father's field and then the father dies and we inherit all the fields around, and I want the field that's right next to mine. And I say, I lay claims to this one. Rabba says, Kofina midat Stom. This is like the people of Stom who, are terrible. If we let the brothers say no, that's terrible. Like, let this brother have the field that's right next to him. And Rav Yosef says no. The brothers could claim this is a much better field. It's like the Sadeh of Bar Merion. Remember that, the house in Bar Merion? And they could claim it's not fair that you should claim it over us, and they can insist. And we hold that way, that they can insist. Inyan is when we do a kinyan chalipin, like this, the handkerchief thing, or some sort of symbolic sale, it's not exactly as strong as a regular sale. You actually have some time to renege. Till when do you have to renege? Rav Yosef says, as long as you're still talking about the same thing, you can renege. And Rabba says you could even be sitting still. As long as you haven't stood up, even though you're not talking about the same issue, you could still change your mind, but we hold like Rav Yosef, the earlier stage. And this issue of mechza, we hold that the woman gets 50%. And so for all those cases where they were kind of against the woman getting here, the woman actually gets 50%. Okay, I said we're going to talk about a lot of cases where we try to figure out what was the person thinking. A lot of them were wording. This is not wording. This is a person sends to their home silk for their house. How do we know how to divide it among the people in the household? I'm a Rabbi Ami. Haruyin lebanim lebanim, ruyin lebanot lebanot. I guess depending on the color, what type of silk. There was certain silk that men use, certain silk that women use. So whatever for the men goes to the sons. Whatever to the women goes to the daughters. There's some commentaries to talk about what about the wife? Maybe the wife, it's a case where there is no wife. Maybe the wife gets everything if she's there. It's unclear what to do about the wife here. But let's just talk about what it says and not what it doesn't say. So the girls get what's for the girls. But then they say, well, the law moran ela delay lekalta. Aval lekalata lekalte shada. That's only if there's no daughters-in-law. But if there's daughters-in-law, it's obvious it was meant for them. That's a little weird. What? Leaves his daughters? Well, they say, well, if the daughters are unmarried, then of course it goes, we don't assume that he was ignoring his daughters and gave it to the daughters-in-law. Okay, to understand this, we have to think a little better what they're saying. So first of all, if they weren't married, perhaps he certainly wouldn't mean not to give to them, because when they're not married, shiduchim, right? They have to get married, they have to dress nicely. So of course he gave it to them. But there's another, I think maybe better way to explain it, which is like this. If they're not married, they're living in the household. If they're married, the way it worked was that, and this explains this very well, and we're going to see this in tomorrow's daf as well. The way it worked is usually the sons would live with the family. And the daughters, when they got married, they would move to where the son went, which was living with his family. So the point is, if they're unmarried, they're still part of the household, and then the daughters get. If they're not part of the household anymore, then we assume it was for the daughters-in-law because they're the ones living in the household and part of the household. So that's a much better way to explain what this is saying. Next case. We're going to have two cases where someone says to my sons, but he doesn't have sons. He has, in one case, a son and a daughter. In another case, a son and a grandson. So the question is, when he said sons, did he mean, now, first of all, you have to remember, if all he has is one son, obviously the son's going to get it. So why would he say sons and only mean son? And why would he even give it to him in the first place? So perhaps it's including the daughter, perhaps it's including the grandson. So let's see. Havale bara ubarta. So he said, my property to my sons, and he had a son and a daughter. Mi karu inashe lebra bane. Do we say that he was just calling his son sons? And why then? Okay, then you have to explain why would he be giving it to her? Well, if you read the parentheses or don't, but l'siluke lebarta mi isorkate. What was he trying to do? He was trying to write out the daughter from getting the 10% that she gets for her dowry, because, or perhaps the mizonot. In other words, once there's no estate, there's no Yerusha, well, there's nothing to support the girl from. So he gave it to the son as a gift so that the daughter wouldn't get anything. Or, Odilma, lo karyanashe libra banai, or do we say people don't call a single son sons, and therefore, lemashcha lebarta b'matanakate. He wanted to include the daughter and give the daughter as a gift, because the daughter wouldn't inherit otherwise. So which one is it? Amar Abai Tashma. Let's learn it from Psukim in the Torah. Ubenei Dan Hushim. The sons of Dan, and then it says his name was Hushim. That was one person. And it says Banei. So what do you see here? Banei could be, Banim plural could mean one son. Amalei Rava. Rava says bad proof. Dilmud Kiddutani de Bechizkia. Shayu merubim kechushim shel kaneh. In Beit Chizkiah, they said his name wasn't Chushim. It's a bit of a weird name. You might remember there's a famous story with him when Esav dies, and he comes when they're at Esav and Yaakov are at the burial of Yitzchak. There's a whole fight, and they send Naphtali shlucha, and then he goes running to Mitzrayim to figure out, and then basically they stab. The Chushim gets up and stabs Esav. Anyway, an interesting story there. So we learned it, I forget, in Sota, forget the daf, maybe Kaftalid. Anyway, okay, so now, his name wasn't Chushim. He was, it was just that he had so many sons, they were like a bunch of reeds. Ella Amarava, but Rava says, but I have a different pasuk. Ubnei falu Eliav. Rav Yosef Amar B'nei Eitan Azario. Okay, why you would choose one pasuk over another, I don't know. But here you see cases where it says B'nei, and it was talking about one son. So really, B'nei could be one son, and therefore you can't say the daughter gets any portion. Hauda Amarlu Nichsar LeB'nai. Same thing. My possessions to my sons. Havale Bara Ubarbara, and he had a son and a grandson. So Kari Nashe the Bar Bara Bra. Although, do people call a grandson a son or not? Rav Chaviva Amar Kari Nashe the Bar Bara Bra. People call, it's like a funny thing to say, Barbara, the son of a son, call a grandson, call a son, meaning the grandson's called a son. And lo people don't do this. So we have two approaches. Tanya Kavate to Marbar Avashi, but they bring a proof from Marbar Avashi that actually it doesn't include the grandson. Mudar Hanami Banim, Mutar B'nei Banim. If you say I'm not going to get any benefit from my sons, you're actually permitted to get benefit from your grandson. So there you see, the word sons does not include grandsons. New Mishnah. Hiniach Banim B'dolim Uchtani. We're now talking about, and we'll spend a lot more time on this in tomorrow's stuff, the estate of the father's there. The father dies. They haven't divided it up yet. And some of the older children, there's older children, younger children, the older children want to start investing and making profit off of it. The question is, who do the profits get divided by? And no one has any portion yet that's for them. Everything's just together. So, hishbichu gdolim et hanechasim, hishbichu la'emtza. Gets divided evenly. That makes a lot of sense. However, if they say, look at what our father left, meaning we want to take our part, you take your part, and they go to the court to divide it up, but the court, according to the Rashbamits, they go to the court doesn't do its job and doesn't divide the property, and they don't want to wait. They're losing money here every day. Hare anu osim v'ochlim, right? They say, look, this is what our father left. We want to take our part and make profit on it. Hishbichu latzmam. Whatever they invest in, they get the profits for. Now, there's a big debate about how to understand this. Does this mean, theoretically, if they took all the land and invested it, then they get all the profits, even though they're making profits off the young son's part? And the theory would be yes, because the young kids aren't doing anything anyway, and they said, let's divide it, but no one did anything about it. So it's not their problem. They can actually benefit. They're not causing any loss for the children. Some people say it just means that the part that they inherit later on, whatever profits were made on that part, they get completely. They don't have to share. Perhaps it's part of it. Anyway, it's a bit of a debate how to understand what actual shevach they get just for themselves. And the same is true for a woman. If it was the wife and she invests the property, again, it gets split. Now, it would have to be a case, we're assuming, where she was one of the heirs with the sons. Again, it would be split 50-50, evenly. She says, look, he left me this part, and I'm going to invest my part, or I'm going to invest the whole thing. In other words, you take yours, I take mine. And if you don't, well, I'll just invest it all. Then then she gets it herself. Amar Rav Chaviv Bered Rav Yosef, Bered Rav Mishmei Rava, Lo Shanu Ela Sheshavchu Nechasim Machmat Nechasim. When we say hishbichu la'emtza, that's only when they invested with the money that was already in the estate and not their own funds, or also in a way where they were just managing and they weren't actually physically working themselves. Okay, like they just kind of hired someone, had someone else deal with it. Then we can say hishbichu la'emtza. But shavchu nechasim machmat atzman, hishbichu la'atzman. But if they go invest their own money in the estate and their own time, of course, they were doing it only for themselves. We don't assume that the other brothers get that. That's something we're going to discuss tomorrow a little bit more. Okay, and the Gemara is going to ask a question on that, and we'll get to that in tomorrow's daf. So what we did today, very quickly, we started with that story with the son. Does he get a portion? Because he was promised a portion like them. Some people said yes, some people said no, but in the end, they proved that the reasoning was really, it's like you like a donkey, and that's nothing. So you're getting something like nothing, it's nothing. And then we compare that, though, to kinei at vichamol, and then we had a three-way debate about it. We tried to bring proofs for Rav Sheshet that you could acquire the whole thing, but all the proofs ended up not really proving to be good proofs. All the comparisons to cases were rejected. Then we had the issue of for you and for the wife and the sons, does the wife get 50% or does the wife get a portion like all the sons? And we brought proofs either, right, trying to prove either different sides. Again, most of the proofs got rejected, but in the end, we passed like Rav Yosef that she gets 50%. Then we had Nefsai Lebanai, my sons, and there was only a son and a daughter. There was only a son and a grandson. In the end, we seemed to be siding on at least. I mean, there was a machloket on the second one. First one seemed pretty clear. The daughter's not included. The second case seemed to be a little bit unclear, but was tipped balanced towards saying it really is just the son based on this Braita that's proved that side. And then we got to this issue of investing the possessions, which we'll deal with a lot more in tomorrow's daf. Wishing everyone a Shabbat Shalom and B'sarot Tovot.